Go. Good evening, everyone. My name is Brian Hurley. I am acting chairman of the Board of Appeals for the purposes of the comprehensive permit application for 648 Canton Avenue in Milton. With me this evening are other members of the board for purposes of this comprehensive permit application, Ted Daber and Michael Brown. And the three of us together will act as the board and ultimately make the decision with respect to the application. Just for the record, I'm going to lay out some of the names of the participants in this process. The applicant is Comprehensive Land Holdings, LLC. The lawyer for the applicant team is Jesse Schomer, SCHOMER of Regnati and Stereo in Wakefield. The architect is Embark. Traffic consultant is MDM Transportation Consultants. Civil engineers are DeSalle, Burke, Saller, and Associates. And the landscaping is done by Verdant. There are a number of peer review teams that have been, or firms that have been retained on behalf of the town. There's site civil, stormwater, and environmental is being handled by Tetra Tech. Design review is being handled by Davis Square Architects, and traffic is being handled by Vanass Associates. The town of Milton will be an active participant in this process, is represented by Tim Zawinski. And Tim, I think you would ask to say a few words, and I invite you to do so at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for giving me the time to introduce myself. As you said, my name is Tim Zerwinski. I am the Director of Planning and Community Development for the town of Milton. And I just wanted to take just a couple moments to introduce myself to the development team knows me. We've been in another hearing together, but some of the members of the public that may be this is the first hearing on a substantive nature on this project. I am the Director of Planning and Community Development. I've been in that role since late July of 2020. Just by way of background, prior to that, I served as a project manager and a senior project manager in the Development Review Department for the Boston Planning and Development Agency. If you've ever been downtown or more or less anywhere in Boston and have seen a crane, that crane went through my department in terms of development review and eventual approval to do those large projects. My role was to manage the review of large projects, both on an internal city hall level in terms of making sure that everyone who had a review function in city government had a chance to review and offer their comments on large projects, and also manage the public-facing community component of those reviews. Managing community meetings, being really the liaison between city government and the public on development review projects. My portfolio went from a 14-unit triple-decker remodel in Fields Corner to the 11 million square foot Suffolk Downs project in East Boston, and all sorts of projects in between, from South Boston to the Fenway to Roxbury to Dorchester. I'm not saying that to wow anyone with my amazing credentials. They're not that amazing, but I just want to give people the confidence that the town has entrusted me to monitor and to participate in these hearings because this is a permitting process. And I have a good deal of experience of managing development review and being a part of land use permitting processes. Prior to my experience in the city of Boston, I was the assistant town planner here in Milton. So very much familiar with the town and its issues. And so just wanted to, give people a little bit of my background, give them a little bit of confidence that the town does have a hand on the tiller in terms of the review of this project and all of the 40B projects. We also have retained special counsel advising the town and the select board in particular on 40B projects. So, that is something I know we did get a number of comment letters about, what is the nature of the town's representation and participation in these hearings. And so that's me. I'm the liaison between this process and the town. And we also have in the background, special counsel advising us in a legal sense on any issues that may arise. So, Mr. Chair, thank you for allowing me the time to introduce myself, and I'm going to fade back into the background.
Thank you, Tim. That was helpful. Your statement reminds me that I probably should take a moment to explain to everyone that's involved this evening the role of the Milton Zoning Board of Appeals. We are impartial arbiters, if you will, of this application process. We don't represent the town. We don't represent anybody. We stand alone, and our job is to hear the evidence, assess that evidence, and ultimately to make a decision that fits within the parameters of the 40B law. And that's what our role is, and that's what we will do. After hearing all the evidence, we will ultimately issue a written decision. That will be obviously a public document and subject to appeal, but that is our process, to be similar, not exactly the same, but similar to a court of law in evaluating the evidence that is presented to us and reaching a decision within the construct of 40B. And so the town is represented, and we are really a separate entity apart from the town as we consider this application process. Just let me run through some of the players, since this is really the first full get together that we've had that we might hear from during the course of these proceedings. We will hear from the applicant team that I've just outlined for you. At some point, we will hear from the peer review firms that have been retained by the town for the assistance of the Zoning Board of Appeals. In addition to those folks, we will certainly take public testimony from members of the public. And in terms of that testimony, we're going to ask everyone to be mindful of time constraints, mindful of other questions, other comments that have been made to the board. We will try to keep each participant in the range of 3 to 5 minutes in their comments, all to be sure that we move forward in sort of an efficient process here, but we certainly welcome and expect public participation in the process. If members of the public have questions that they want to pose to people who have testified, including the applicant team or the peer reviewers, we will ask that those questions be directed to the board. We don't want to have a direct exchange between people who have offered their testimony and people who are asking questions. So those are some of the sort of procedural ground rules that we will follow as we go forward. As many of you know, we opened the public hearing some weeks ago. It was really just for the purpose of opening the hearing and sort of briefly discuss the project. We had a site visit. Actually, we had 2 site visits on Saturday, March 6th. 2 groups of people who had signed up for the site visits participated. I participated in the first, which started at 10 o'clock on Saturday. It was just about a 1-hour visit and presentation. It was tremendously helpful to me to really have a feel for this project as we begin to hear the testimony. As I said, a number of members of the public had signed up, and I hope they found it as sort of informative as I did. Tonight is the first hearing where we're going to actively take testimony. And the idea is that we would have the applicant through whatever persons or whatever entities on the application team come forward and to sort of present to us the various aspects of the proposal. And with that in mind, I guess I would ask Jesse Schomer if you want to proceed.
Mr. Chair, Ned Corcoran, may I speak at the moment?
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm Ned Corcoran. I am an attorney here in Milton and representing most of the direct abutters to the property on the easterly side of Canton Avenue. I had filed a motion with this board to consider a stay on the application pending a review of whether or not the addition of a project proposed at 652 Canton Avenue, and which is wholly dependent upon 648 for access and for civil and site efforts. There's a major substantial change to the project before you. And I think the board ought to consider, before it goes forward, what the implications of the addition of 652 would be to the 648 project. It could render this hearing moot if we were to go forward after this hearing with an additional hearing associated with 652 using the same site driveway. Traffic would be no good. We'd have to start over with traffic. We'd need all new plans, et cetera. And I think it would be a waste of this board's time to go forward on 648 until we know what the clear intention of the developer is with respect to 652. And I think
Let me just ask you a question, Mr. Corcoran. When you say you want us to stay the process, stay it until when?
Until Mass Housing can issue a determination whether the addition of 652 is a substantive change to the 648 project. They're clearly dependent upon each other. The information that's been presented, that's been filed, would be moot, be no good. You're adding 65% addition of units, 73% additional volume of parking spaces, and like amount of traffic using the same site driveway. I think it's important that this board stay and wait for Mass Housing to issue a determination. The town has requested that in its comment letter to 652. We filed a similar request with Mass Housing with respect to the project eligibility. I don't think this matter is prepared to go forward unless the developer is going to sit here and say that 652 is off the table. We're not interested in doing 652. We're going to go forward with 648 alone.
Do you have a time frame? Can I just ask one question? Do you have a time frame on when you would anticipate some kind of a response from Mass Housing?
I don't. I know that my letter was submitted a month ago. I know that the select board's comments were submitted by February 25th. Perhaps Ms. Barrett has a little bit more information on the time frame that Mass Housing would be operating under with respect to that specific issue.
For you, Mr. Chair, I don't know. I mean, Mass Housing takes whatever time they're going to take reviewing a project eligibility application. Some of them move quickly, some of them take many months. So I just can't shed light on the implications of what Attorney Corcoran is suggesting. We don't know. It could come tomorrow. It could come in 3 months. It may not come at all.
Okay. Mr. Shaw, what do you say?
Well, Mr. Chair, thank you and good evening to you and to Mr. Corcoran and members of the board. Our position is, we stated in our letter to the board responding to Attorney Corcoran's his position. There's from our perspective, there's no procedural basis for the zoning board to stay a proceeding. And what I can report to you, Mr. Chair, and to the board members is that we've had conversations with Mass Housing, and they consider the 652 Canton Avenue project to be entirely separate. And they've assured us that project will be weighed on its own merits, and is not considered by them to be dependent on this one or vice versa. So with that having been said, what I would say is, in terms of the effect of that project, if we are assuming it gets site approval, which we don't know if it will at this point, from our perspective, the only effect that project would have on this project is the access arrangement, whereby the main project traffic would go through this site. That project would not affect in any way the site infrastructure, the civil engineering, the architecture, the landscape design, all sorts of aspects of the project that could be discussed by the board and could be addressed by the board within the finite amount of time that the Chapter 40B statute provides the board. So my recommendation and my suggestion to the board members would be to proceed with this hearing. And if excuse me, if 652 Canton Avenue is approved at some point down the road, we would, as Ms. Barrett mentioned, there's no indication of if and or when that would happen. Then if that happens, and we can address with the board how to proceed at that point. But I think it is a good use of time at this point to proceed with this hearing. Thank you.
I'll ask my fellow board members for their thoughts on this issue. Mr. Daver? Seems to be muted, I think.
Ted, you're on mute.
On mute.
There you go.
Can you hear me now? Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes,
Okay.
Ted. Yes.
Attorney Schomer seems to be saying that there's no procedure for a stay. Do you have any thoughts on that, Mr. Chairman? I mean, is it something that we could do if we were so inclined under the rules?
I don't think there's a clear answer to that question, Mr. Daver. My concern would be that obviously there are statutory deadlines that we have to meet that fall within. And absent agreement from the applicant to extend those deadlines, I think we would run a risk that we'd end up in some form of a constructive approval if we unilaterally decided to stay the proceedings here. And the risk that I would be inclined to take, frankly. I take Mr. Corcoran's position. I understand that it's a legitimate and well-founded motion, but I think the risk is significant for us if we were to stay it without an agreement to do so. So on that, because of that concern, I would not be inclined to stay these proceedings. But let me ask Mr. Brown for his thoughts on this.
My concern is similar to Mr. Daver's, but my feelings are the same as yours, Mr. Chair. I certainly see the logical need, or the logical desire to have both of these decided, or at least more clarity on the current application before moving forward. However, we are under these deadlines, and I think it would be unwise to postpone the entire proceeding based on an expectation of receiving some kind of clarity from Mass Housing when we don't know when we're going to get it or if we're going to get it. So what I would hope to happen would be, or what I think we should do, is proceed with the proceedings with the hope of getting a response from Mass Housing as the proceedings are ongoing. And I don't know if there's anything that anybody could do to speed that along or to give more clarification on that, but that would be my thought.
Well, this process, this public hearing process, is going to take some time. It's going to extend out over a number of weeks, I think. So we have some time to come back and revisit this issue. I mean, I'm not unsympathetic to the notion that certainly the traffic impacts of a second adjoining property will be of consequence in the determination. And so, all things being equal, if we could consider both projects at once, that would be great. But that's not what's presented to us at the moment. So my inclination would be to deny the motion. I guess I would do so without prejudice to its being renewed at some other point or points during this process. Mr. Corcoran, for the time being, my preference would be, and I would vote in favor of going forward with the public hearings as we currently have them scheduled, but staying mindful of this other project and its potential impacts as we go along. That would be my inclination. Mr. David, is that acceptable to you?
I think it'd be certainly helpful to know that the board would entertain this motion again should project eligibility come forward, because as I read the 652 application, you almost have to start from scratch.
Absolutely, Mr. Corcoran. We would deny the
massive
motion without prejudice to you renewing it.
Right. Thank you.
Mr. David, is that acceptable to you as an approach?
That is acceptable to me, Mr. Chairman.
And Mr. Brown?
Acceptable to me, yes.
Okay.
May I
Well,
ask a further question, Mr. Hurley?
absolutely.
You've identified, at least preliminarily, a layout of a process where the developer will present and the peer reviews will present. The neighborhood has retained 4 other experts to review and submit questions on behalf of the neighborhood. As I've observed the 852 Blue Hill Avenue project, those experts have been allowed to comment immediately after the presentations made by the applicant's experts. I'm wondering whether this board would consider the same opportunity here.
So they would do that before the peer reviewers came on?
It was done before the peer reviews, I think, because in part in the Blue Hill Avenue, the peer reviewers hadn't been retained.
That is correct.
Right.
But they often had other issues identified that the board felt were important to be responded to in the process. And I think it would be harmful if there was an undue delay in the ability to raise those issues at the end rather than during the process.
My understanding is that the peer reviewers either are ready or will soon be ready to present their testimony.
They are scheduled. They are scheduled, Mr. Chair.
Okay, so we don't have the problem I think that you have with the Blue Hill Avenue. So my preference would be to go forward, have the testimony, presentation by the applicant, testimony and comments from the town. We've heard from this evening, Mr. Chiminski, to hear from the board's peer reviewers, and then after the board's peer reviewers, before we make any decisions on next steps, then we would hear from whatever people you want to present to, who could comment on what the town had said, what the applicant had said, what the peer reviewers had said, and testify in their own right with respect to issues or problems that they see with the development of the proposal. So I mean, I certainly would welcome their testimony to come sort of in that order.
Thank you.
You're welcome, Mr. Corcoran. Any other procedural issues or questions at this point? Okay, then without further ado, why don't we ask the applicant to come forward and begin their presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just once again, for the record, my name is Attorney Jesse Schomer. The law offices of Rignante Stereo out of Wakefield. Our development team that's here tonight, Mr. Chair, and members of the board are D'Artagnan Brown and Dan Riggs from Embark Architecture, Jim DeSelle from DeSelle Burke Sala Civil Engineers, Bob Michaud of MDM Transportation, Traffic and Safety Consultant, and I believe Blair Hines, I see him there, he's our landscape architecture with Verdant Landscape Design. And we'll all be making brief presentations to the board members tonight. And I think what we would have in mind is to provide, as it were, a 30,000-foot view of this project, just general overviews of each area. And then as the hearings proceed, we could drill down into greater detail, particularly as the peer review reports come in. At this time, if it please the board, I would like, if I may, to provide just a general overview of the process and the 40B law for perhaps more for those at home who may not be as familiar with Chapter 40B as the board members and their consultants, I'm sure, are. But in a nutshell, what we're here tonight, board members and members of the public, is for a proposal to develop the property that's located at 648 Canton Avenue with a 124-unit rental development permitted under Chapter 40B. And there was some mention a few moments ago about statutory deadlines. And under Chapter 40B, the permitting process that we're in process now is a 180-day process from the date that the public hearing is opened, which was back in January. After that 180 days, the board has a period of time to issue a decision on this application. That would be either an approval with conditions, or a denial of the project. And so we're hoping to present this project to the board members And I'm sure that this will go through some revisions, but the goal would be to get to an approval that the board could be comfortable with, and that the applicant as well as the neighbors could be comfortable with. So just to back up for a moment on the issue of Chapter 40B for those who may not be familiar with it, that's a reference to Chapter 40B of the Mass General Laws. It's a state law that was passed in the late 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement, just a year after the Federal Fair Housing Act was passed. It was passed at the time in response to a pretty serious housing crisis that was created by a number of factors. And the process that we're here tonight to discuss is the comprehensive permitting process, which is just one component of Chapter 40B, which was enacted as a much broader regional planning tool. The process that we're here tonight is probably the best known, and because it's the process that the most people are the most familiar with. But what 40B does is it designates the local zoning board of appeals as the comprehensive permit granting authority in your community. And as the name comprehensive permit implies, a comprehensive permit is intended to encompass all local approvals that are needed to develop a project under one single comprehensive permit from the zoning board of appeals. And so what that means in this case is, for a project that might otherwise need to go, for example, to the planning board for a site plan approval, or to the local conservation commission for a local stormwater permit or something of that nature, all of those approvals would fall under the same single comprehensive permit that would be issued by this board. The other aspect of the comprehensive permit process that we should talk about is the issue of waivers. And what that means is the 40B process allows applicants to request waivers from local bylaws where there's a determination from the board that there is a regional need for affordable housing that outweighs the local concern that is protected by a particular local bylaw. So at this point, I want to point out that even within this comprehensive permit process, applicants like my clients are still required to obtain any and all state and federal permits and approvals, and they are required to comply with all state and federal laws. There's no waivers from state or federal laws. It's only from the local permits. Now, in terms of measuring whether a particular community has an affordable housing need and whether that need outweighs local concerns, Chapter 40B imposes several statutory minimums for how much affordable housing each community is required to provide. Now, there are several statutory minimums, but for our purposes, the relevant one is whether the town of Milton has 10% of its total year-round housing stock dedicated to affordable housing. In this case, the town of Milton, the affordability percentage is somewhere just under 5%, approximately 4.9. Now, under Chapter 40B, the regional need for affordable housing is typically presumed to outweigh local concerns where this statutory 10% minimum is not met. And by regulation, this presumption becomes stronger the further the community is from its 10% affordability goal. Now, as I mentioned before, the town of Milton is currently at 4.9% affordable, which represents 477 affordable units out of 9,641 total units. And that was calculated by the Department of Housing and Community Development as of December of last year, just a couple of months ago. I think it's important to talk for just a brief moment about why Milton is only at 4.9%. And there are probably a number of reasons, but perhaps one of the more significant reasons is that under the town's current zoning bylaw, over 90% of the town's land area is zoned for single family, with single family residential use representing the primary as of right use, and in many instances, the only as of right use that's permitted on over 90% of the town's land. This restriction effectively places a hard limit on how many housing units can be built in Milton, which has the effect of driving up housing and land prices and imposes barriers to entry to the local housing market. And because Milton is largely built out under current zoning requirements, there are very few sites in Milton that would permit development at a level of density that is needed to bring the town closer to the 10% affordability goal. Now, as I mentioned before, 477 current units currently in Milton are designated as affordable by the state. Of those units, approximately 3/4 of them were permitted before the year 2000. And in the last 15 years, only 6 new affordable units were permitted in the entire town of Milton. Of the 477 affordable units in Milton, the vast majority of those are age-restricted units, and that would be in the Unquity House and the Winter Valley housing development. And that's important because the age restriction on those units means that those affordable units are not available to some of the communities that Chapter 40B is intended to serve, and that would be communities like young families and essential and frontline workers who serve a vital role in the town of Milton and often aren't able to afford to live there. I think it's also notable that of your neighbors, your neighboring communities, all of the surrounding town and cities, including Boston, Quincy, Braintree, Randolph, Canton, and Dedham, are all currently within half a percentage point of 10% or above it. And in some cases, as in the case of Boston, significantly above it. Now, because Milton is less than halfway to the 10% affordability goal, there is, in this case, a strong presumption that local needs do not outweigh the need for affordable housing, and therefore that the applicant would be entitled to receive the waivers it has requested from this board. Under the Chapter 40B process, the board can deny waivers only where it can prove that specific local concerns outweigh the regional need for affordable housing. And relevant local concerns under 40B include concerns as to health and safety, environmental concerns, and design concerns. I'd also just like to note, finally, as to the 40B process, that in weighing whether there are local concerns that outweigh the need for affordable housing, the town is not permitted to impose requirements that it would not normally impose on non-affordable projects. So, for example, if the town's public utility services or street infrastructure is inadequate for public needs, the cost to upgrade those typically cannot be imposed on 40B developments if those same costs would not normally be imposed on a non-40B development, such as a single-family home. And similarly, concerns regarding neighborhood impacts are typically found not to outweigh the need for affordable housing where comparable impacts have been permitted in non-40B cases. For example, here I have in mind the case of Unquity House, to bring that up again, where the town actually permitted a 6-story, 65-foot building within 60 feet of abutting single-family homes. And that's relevant to the issue of density and massing, which we'll get into in a few moments. But that's, I appreciate the board indulging me in that brief overview of 40B and the process ahead of us. And I'd like to pivot from there to talk about our specific project. And I hope that overview gives a little bit of context that's helpful for everyone as we move into this process. So the project site, as I mentioned, is located at 648 Canton Avenue. It's situated in a neighborhood that supports a number of mixed uses, including the Milton Municipal Offices, Town Hall, Milton High School, Beth Israel Hospital, and there's also a public library and there's also a public library and a church directly near the property. The site itself is approximately 4.7 acres, and it's currently developed with a single family home with a clay tennis court and various outbuildings. The proposal that we're looking forward to discussing with the board tonight would be to develop the property with 124 unit apartment building, which would be above a garage parking level. The units that we're proposing would be 54% 1-bedroom, 36% 2-bedroom, and 10% 3-bedroom, and the latter of which is a requirement under Chapter 40B. Now, of these 124 units, 25% or 31 units would be designated as affordable to residents earning at or below 80% of the area median income. And under current DHCD guidelines, which aim to promote rental housing, which in communities like Milton is a particularly underserved need, the guidelines provide that all 124 units would be eligible to be counted towards the town's 10% affordability goal, which in this case would bring the town up to approximately 6.2%. And together with some of the other 40Bs that are currently pending in town, would bring Milton very close to the 10% affordability goal. So with that having been said, Mr. Chair and board members, I'd like to turn things over next to our architect, D'Artagnan Brown from Embark Architecture, for a discussion of the details of the building. And thank you very much for entertaining us tonight.
Before we turn it over, Mr. Schumer, I'd just like to put it out there to see if anyone has any questions of you in particular about any of the points that you've raised.
Certainly.
Mr. Corcoran or anyone, and if not, we can move on. Okay, well, why don't we move on to the next presenter, Mr. Schumer?
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Jesse. Good evening, Mr. Chair, members of the board. D'Artagnan Brown, principal at Embark. Tonight with me, I have Daniel Riggs and Tim Loranger, architects as well with Embark. And we genuinely appreciate your time, and we look forward to giving a overview of the project as presented tonight. By way of background, as Mr. Chairman mentioned, we did a couple site walks where we had the opportunity to bring not only the members of the board, but also the abutting neighbors through this unique property. As Jesse mentioned, we're a little over 4.5 acres situated off of Canton Ave. We're going to walk tonight through kind of a high-level presentation with the understanding that we're going to move through a couple disciplines, and then at subsequent hearings, deep dive into various disciplines. With that, I'm going to ask Daniel from our office to kind of give it a contextual setting, and then I'll walk through more of the site-specific strategies and how we arrived at the massing, and then we'll move through landscape next.
Thank you, D'Artagnan, and thank you to the board for your time. I'll just take a few moments to help situate the project within the greater Milton context. So here you can see where the cursor is right now. That's our site, located off of Canton Avenue. So it's within a half of a mile of Milton Town Hall, the center of Milton, Beth Israel Hospital, the Winter Valley residences, the Milton High School, and it's also located off of Blue Hills Parkway, the Blue Hill Avenue, and within a mile of Milton Academy, Milton Public Library, and the Milton Police Station. So we go to the next slide, D'Artagnan. And actually, before you move, you can see the other these two commuter rail stations on the just west of our site as well. So zooming in, you can see again that's our site with the magenta border. To the northeast, there's Winter Valley Residences, pretty dense cluster of homes, multifamily development of 160 units. Directly north of us, there's another development between Canton Avenue and Thatcher Street, consists of 175 homes. To the northwest of our site, almost directly adjacent, is the Milton High School building and facilities. And to the southwest of our site, there's 172 homes located between Canton Avenue and Indian Spring Road. So zooming in again, one of the things that we look at initially are some of the adjacencies that these other developments have with their context. So looking at the Winter Valley Residences here a little bit more close up, it's another multifamily residential development that is has adjacent homes that are within 125 feet of that development, and we're holding similar distances from the single-family houses on our property, and in some instances larger distances as well. And that development again is 160 units with 2.5 to 3-story buildings located on it. Again, to the south or to the northwest of our site is the Milton High School building. It's a 2 to 4-story structure consisting of a significant amount of excellent surface parking surrounding it. It's also abutted, similar to our projects, abutted by a lot of single-family residences as well. And to the north of our site, northeast, beyond the Winter Valley Residences, another large project that is in a similar context, surrounded by single-family houses, Beth Israel Hospital. So that's a structure that's 3 to 5 stories, directly abutted by single-family uses. So zooming back into our site, so this is a close-up 648 Canton Avenue, as Tartanian mentioned. It's 204,000 square feet, so it's just over 4.5 acres. And with that, I'll hand it back to Tartanian to go into the project in further depth.
Awesome. Thank you, Daniel. So coming off of Canton Ave, a couple of key things to note, and kind of stepping back to the architectural narrative in framing the network of this building, with a couple key points really is kind of site access. And we're going to get into this into site plan, but to really frame it, currently there exists kind of this central road that goes up to the main structure and facilities that are on the property currently. And then one thing to note, which we'll show in a couple site sections in the site plan, is as you move from kind of the northeast portion of the site to the what we call the kind of the rear of the site, there's actually roughly a 10 to 11 foot gradual increase in the topography of the site. One thing we are doing is taking that into account in terms of how we site the building. When we design projects like this, one of our key, beyond the architecture itself, is really understanding contextual setting, not only from how we position the building, but how do we service the building? What are the mitigating factors to the adjacent context? How can we screen kind of the requisite parking? In this approach, with the sloping of the site, we're actually able to inset a garage parking within the topography. So albeit at the kind of northern end of Canton Ave, when you approach, we have a garage structure which will be based with building entry lobby. But as we move back towards the site, it essentially will kind of tuck into the hill. So at that end of the site, it's really, which we'll show you again in more detail, really 4 stories of residential in areas that have greater buffering. And then one thing we'll point out is as we work towards the homes on Holmes Lane, we are doing kind of a careful articulation of mass stepping down from a 4-story to 3-story residential. So along this northeastern property of the site, we're really looking at a 34-foot in height in terms of actual relative structure. So just a couple quick series of photographs. So again, this is coming off of Canton Ave, driveway access into the property. What we'll get through with civil and landscape is a widening of that driveway to allow for a sufficient 2-way access onto the site. As we move up to the site, this is kind of that long colonnade of entry to the existing home. We are looking at positioning of the driveway, even at an early stage, to really save the majority of kind of the heavily matured trees to the page left here. And then we're looking at ways on how we kind of integrate with the existing contextual natural setting on page right here. As you move up to the property, this is the existing structure that is, inbound in essentially about 800 feet back into the site. And then some of the existing connections to Holmes Lane. So if I need to just move the screen for a second, but off of here onto the corner, there's kind of a secondary access onto Holmes Lane as well. And as we move through the site, so we kind of have a little keynote here, but there's just some kind of unkept existing gardens, tennis court, rear property, shed structures, and the like on the property as it exists today. And this is really towards the higher end of the portion as the grading moves up on the site. So by way of kind of more of a topographic overlay, And it's important to note just these are actual kind of grading elevations, and then I'll give you relative numbers. But when you really enter kind of the north end of the site here, northwest end, we're saying off of Canton Ave, we're 92. When we enter into the site, we're 100. And you can see we're actually sloping up to be about 120. And that's how the relative distance of the 10 feet that I mentioned earlier is starting kind of at the northern end of the building to the southern end is really where we pick up that 10 to 12 feet of grade height that we're going to work into the design. So by way of context, and as kind of Daniel alluded to earlier in terms of how we've looked at situating the building itself, we probably went through half a dozen plus massing strategies to arrive at this design as we're presenting this evening. And a lot of it is understanding, under the 40B, how can we achieve the density, but being mindful of the abutting context. And, through the site walks, understanding of the adjacent context, especially the most relatively impacted, what we've done on the northeast side of the site is look at maintaining kind of those buffers that exist currently between Holmes Lane and the Winter Valley residence. So you can see it really at the closest point to the residential structure, we're about 128 feet, which is very similar to the 125 feet on the north end. And then we go anywhere up to 190, up to 200 feet. What we've done here, which maybe is a little unusual, but to really drive some clarity around the massing, is just showing the relative floors of residential structure above the parking, which again tapers from a full 12 feet here to 0 at this end of the site. So on the northeast portion of the site, as you come up and approach, and I'll get into some more architectural site plans, we have a handful of visitor and drop-off locations for package delivery, residents coming to maybe pick up somebody, a visitor coming to meet somebody at the building. And so this is allowing us to kind of service that without having to enter the parking structure. And this main portion of the site is kind of a two-way entry, 24 feet wide. And then as we go around the property, we're tapering down to a 20-foot aisle, which allows for one-way traffic and also in initial discussions and understanding of the life safety requirements on making sure that this is a serviceable building, we can provide kind of full circumferential access to any one point for both fire ladder trucks and ambulatory or police services should that ever be needed. But in terms of the massing, so as you approach the building, to the northeast side, we're at 3 stories. The northwest, north-south side, you can see kind of a modulation of 4 to 3 story, 4 to 3 story as we move back. And then on the southeast side, dropping back down to 3 story. On the rear portion of the site, we do have roughly 16 visitor spaces on the furthest portion with an additional 8 as well on the northeast portion of the balance of that. A couple contextual settings, really just working at this stage through the site topography. So you can see as we move up through the site, this is how we essentially are able to tuck in the parking. So you can imagine where my cursor is, kind of that natural grading moves up through. So at the south end of the property, the parking itself is really tucked in. In terms of a southwest to northeast section, we have a series of landscape courtyards, which our landscape architect, Blair, will get into. But you can see how we've been able to really kind of set the parking garage with the goal of the majority of the parking to be hidden and kind of secluded from the residential neighborhood. And here you can see in cross section, not only in kind of the amenitized courtyard, which we'll get into, but the stepping of moments where we have a 3-story to a 4-story back down to a 3-story. This is an early kind of contextual axonometric of the site. So again, you can see coming off of Canton Ave here, as we come down the colonnade entry that kind of exists today, but it will be widened. We arrive at the central point of the building entry to the northeast. We're stepping down again in scale, kind of noted to the 3 stories. So at this section, it's 34 feet of residential, over 12 feet of garage. At the south end, it's 34 feet over 0 feet of garage. And really at the highest point here, which is kind of the central section of the building facing Canton Ave, this is the highest section here of about 57 feet. But we quickly move through some kind of deliberate massing shifts, not only in terms of height, but in terms of mitigating against length of building facade, to have some substantial site plan moves that allow us to create kind of these ample courtyards in several spots along the site. This is an architectural site plan through really cutting through the underside of the amenity deck. So you can see as we come in off of Canton Ave, we'll have the building lobby amenity. Although initial in terms of planning, we are allowing for ample trash storage, a bike, electrical, water, utility service, just making sure that we can program appropriately. As you move up through the building, and I definitely don't want to steal any thunder from Blair, he'll get into the landscape approach. But in terms of the articulation of the building, we'll have kind of an entry lobby that extends up to an amenity space, so that, not only in terms of designing this mix of the 1s, 2s, and 3s, but we want to make sure on site that we can provide for ample kind of extensions of the unit to make for well thought through design, both in terms of how we've massed in site and then also how we service on site. And then with that, Blair will get into detail, but creating a series of these pocketed landscape courtyard areas that from an architectural perspective, encompass and hide against the parking, but from a kind of usability landscape, have a lot of merits to which Blair will get into. As we move through the building, moving up through the floors. So as I mentioned, within the mix on a typical floor, we'll have 21 beds, 13 2 beds, and three beds on this typical floor. So it's around 36 units per floor, encompassing the 124 overall units. And then as we move up to the 4th floor, this again, you can see not only from how we position the building, but just some of the initial feedback we got with Mass Housing as well, is to really break up the massing of the structure. So what we've done preemptively as well is along the 4-story section, so coming from the 3 to the 4, we've also then pulled back into distinct areas. So we really are trying to articulate the scale of the building into really 3 zones that are 4 stories, and then a balance of 4 zones that are 3 stories. And then still, although early in the process, we want to make sure from an infrastructure perspective, we can set up kind of a logical take to how we technically will service the building. So in terms of being able to allow for all of the rooftop condensers to be set inbound, proper screening, cognizant of sight lines from abutting properties, those are all things that we're definitely taking into consideration and factoring into the design as we move through the process. I think at that point, I'm going to take a quick break from speaking and turn it over to Daniel, if you don't mind, Daniel.
Yeah, thank you, D'Artagnan. Yeah, so as we begin our process in design, we take a look at buildings of similar scale and similar mass within the town, understand how other architects have dealt with similar problems in the past and what solutions they've come to. So you can see here kind of a collection of those images, looking at Milton High School, Milton Academy, the Milton Police Station, Curry College, Milton Town Hall, and how they've kind of dealt with those problems in the past. So certain strategies like using traditional building forms with a more kind of contemporary detailing or modern detailing, like in the Milton Public Library at the top left, using more traditional kind of forms and detailing. The Milton Police Station, kind of linking those buildings together with a kind of a roof structure like you see here. As well as the Cunningham School, very traditional, incorporating the top floor of the building within the roof structure, as you can see here. And Milton High School, which is using kind of traditional building materials in a much more modern way. Go to the next slide. And we also take a look at existing residential buildings within the similar context in the area. Try to pick up on certain strategies there and certain materials that are used, and try to borrow from that vocabulary as much as we can, so that our project feels contextual and fits into the neighborhood context. So a few of those key things that we pick up on are incorporating the top floor of the building within the roof structure, as you can see here at 79 Milton Ave. As well as in the Eustace House, it looks like they actually incorporate 2 floors of the structure into the top of the building, using these kind of single dormers to help articulate the top of the building and add character, using materials like clapboard and stone and masonry, as well as divided light windows and Munson detailing, as well as trim detailing, and trying to pick up on those kind of more finite residential scale elements of the building as we dive into designing. And we do that within the context of multifamily housing as well. So looking at how different elements can help to break up the building, incorporating kind of bay pieces like that, and looking at taller tower elements to help signify entries, like this project right here. So borrowing from some of those other solutions that other architects have come to. Next slide. And we try to incorporate as many of those ideas in a thoughtful way as we could as we started to dive into the design and detailing of our project. So you can see here in this kind of early rendering of the building, this is looking at the front entry as you come up the drive from Canton Avenue. This is the 2-way drive here. This is where that becomes the 1-way path around the building, as well as some of the surface parking here that's sort of situated between some planting on site. Just beyond that, the garage door and the garage entry, as well as the landscaped and habitable deck that happens above that to help activate that space. And you can see the setbacks here as well as the project kind of evolves from the north side of the site to the south. And using tower elements, and again, using the top floor of the building to really feel like it's within the roof structure, and then articulating the windows individually there to create some smaller scale design elements. We're also using clapboard and masonry similar to those examples that we had looked at previously. So these next 2 slides are sort of technical drawings of that same design approach. So this is a north elevation of the front entry of the building. So again, seeing that tower element at the entry to kind of demarcate the entry to the building, using some smaller bay elements to further accentuate and break up these smaller masses of the building. And essentially everywhere we try to pull the building out to create shadow lines and create relief along the facades of the building itself. And this is the moving on to the northeast elevation. So again, this is a little bit of a difficult view, right? Because you'll never actually experience the building in this way, where you see the entirety of it at one time. But again, you can see here presenting to the Holmes Lane residents these smaller portions of the building here at a 2 or 3 stories, with the top floor incorporated into the roof structure as it faces Holmes Lane. And in reality, this deck is landscaped, as Blair will bring you through shortly. And then just to reiterate some of metrics. Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, that's okay. So Dartania's brought you through most of these already, but just again, site area is 204,000 square feet, so it's over 4.6 acres. Total building square footage, gross square footage is 146,730, which is FAR of 0.72. The total parking spaces are 186 for 1.5 ratio of 1.5 spaces per unit. 124 residential units, and as D'Artagnan already mentioned, 66 one-bedrooms, 45 two-bedrooms, and 13 three-bedroom units, and as well as a generous indoor amenity space of 8,000 square feet and outdoor amenity deck of nearly 30,000 square feet.
Thank you, Daniel.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, I don't know if we wanted to go through this or.
This is a comparative slide of other developments within Milton. So looking at some other larger developments and as well as some of the affordable developments such as Unquity House at the bottom left part of the screen there, just looking at the relative density. So that's 4 acres, which is actually slightly less than our site, 139 units. So just a little bit of reference of similar densities in Milton.
Thanks, Daniel. And at this point, we're going to turn it over to Blair Hines, our landscape architect.
For the record, Blair Hines, registered landscape architect and principal of Verdant Landscape Architecture. Our view as we look at a project like this is how we can mitigate and preserve some of the landscape that's existing on this site, especially the landscape that's closest to the abutting neighbors. So our overall goals really are to mitigate the overall development, and secondly is how do we support residential living for all the future people who will be living in this project. In terms of our work with D'Artagnan and with the civil engineer, we promoted how to pull the driveways a little bit closer to the building in order to preserve a little bit more of the trees along the edge towards Holmes Lane. Secondly, to work with the civil engineer around reducing the amount of stormwater detention structures that are along this wooded lane that comes in off of Canton Avenue, which is something that most impressed us, as well as not only is there generally fairly mature oak woodland around the site. There's also a couple of very notable trees, some large beech trees, some large Norway spruce, all of which we're making efforts to try to preserve. This is the kind of initial approach, and we know that there'll be some changes in response to your comments tonight, as well as the project continues to kind of mature through the design process. If you could go to the next slide, please. So in terms of residential living, the most important component of this is really almost a 3/4 acre outdoor space that's lies mostly facing the abutting residents towards Holmes Lane. And as D'Artagnan and Dan had indicated, the idea was to pull the building back and break up the massing, which creates a very kind of interesting series of spaces that are proposed to be landscaped. Most of this area is going to be planted. We're looking at extensions of sedum lawn, which would mostly be an area that basically absorbs stormwater and helps to mitigate the impact of the development, as well as have shrubs and trees that will be planted within it in order to create, instead of think about a lawn, but instead of using grass species, you're using sedum species. Secondly, we're also looking at a series of outdoor spaces that kind of support outdoor living, these little, what we call living room ensembles, as well as little dining areas as well, that you can see kind of located around in different kind of garden shapes within this courtyard. We're also proposing an area of synthetic turf, which we're thinking about as a play area that's located to the sheet top just left of that large sort of patio dining space up and through there. And this represents, I would say, more of our project approach. We will continue to refine this with both the developer as we move forward. And the other important aspect of outdoor living that we've worked with Embark Architects is to create some small, what we call semi-private outdoor spaces that are associated with the various amenity deck floor private units. And you can see there's a whole series of small rectangles which represent semi-private patios associated with those units, both facing onto the deck. And I think if you go to the sheet above, D'Artagnan or Dan, go up one.
Sorry, it's just processing. 1 second.
No, that's okay. I just was going to point out that we're also looking for opportunities. I think it's the other, that's right. Along the south side of this building, I'll just speak to it. We can stay with this. There are also a series of outdoor terraces that are faced along the edge of the parking area, again, to provide some outdoor living. And I want to reiterate one thing that I think is a really important strategy for how to mitigate this, obviously large building on this site. And I think that the whole idea of burying the parking is something that we think is a really important strategy. And to that end, we've been working with the civil engineer and with the architects around the grading such that as much as possible, we can bring that amenity deck to be equal to the grade along the sheet top, which would be closest to Holmes Lane. So again, the landscape of the courtyard really presents a kind of a normal landscape relationship to the site rather than being kind of perched above a kind of a roadway and a wall that behind which is the garage structure. As you see around here, we're thinking about different types of plant materials to shade the driveway, to help to reduce the scale of the building, and to also create a series of garden spaces. And lastly, one of the things that we also pay a lot of attention to, which is the habitat value of not only what's here, but also what's being put in terms of plant materials. And we look for opportunities. We rely on native plants, pollinator plants, and so forth that help to sustain the larger environment. I think that's my presentation. D'Artagnan.
Awesome. Thank you, Blair. With that, let's go over to our civil engineering, Jim DeSalle.
How you doing? My name is Jim DeSalle from DeSalle Burke & Associates. With me tonight is Cam Campbell from our office. As you can see, this is the existing conditions on the site right now. We did a series of 6 test pits. There were 4 up front in the area that we were looking to do our drainage. And then there's one up towards Holmes Lane. And then there's one towards the rear of the property down by the tennis court and the little shed back there. You want to go to the next sheet? Thank you. This is roughly the layout of the property. We had originally planned on using the existing driveway to, is coming up the main entrance in approximately 26 feet to start, and that had to do with the fire department turning radiuses. And then it's a 24-foot 2-lane road. And surrounding the property, we have it'll be 2 lanes that go to the garage entrance. And then we could either have 1-way traffic or 2-way traffic because we have enough room, depending on how the fire department sees fit. We have a 22-foot wide access road going in there. We've had some conversations, and there was a peer review letter that would like the entrance of the driveway moved a little bit, and we're going to look into that a little bit to see if we can move that, because right now when you're driving down driveway, you're going dead smack into the house right across the street. So we're going to take a peek at that in future iterations of the project. We have water and sewer coming in from Canton Avenue. We have power coming in underground from a pole that's actually on our property now on Holmes Lane. And the drainage, which we have 4 separate drainage systems, and we'll see that on a future slide, that come down, and it's more of a detention. The next slide over. Okay, you can see the 4 areas where we have detention, and what happens is the stormwater goes into these systems, it gets held, and it gets let out into the town system through a control structure, and we'll get into that in a future detail once the peer review people get to review it. But it's pretty much just a 3-foot pipes that just hold the water, and then we let it out over time after the storm event has dissipated. The site, they've already talked about the grading on the site. We tried to maintain the driveway as best to mimic exactly what's going on there right now. We try to hold, we go up the driveway. We start at elevation 92 at the Canton Avenue. We go up to approximately 108 at the split in the new driveway. And then it's approximately elevation 122 in the back parking area. So we're pretty much holding, obviously we're smoothing out the road, but we are pretty much holding the existing grades. So we're not, we're working with the grades, not against the grades. And that's pretty much the engineering portion of this.
Awesome. Thank you, Jim. At this point, we're going to turn it over to our traffic and transportation. I think Bob is on the line.
Yes, thank you, D'Artagnan. Chair and board members, thank you for the opportunity. My name is Robert Michaud, a principal with MDM Transportation Consultants. We're based in Marlborough, Massachusetts. We've conducted a comprehensive traffic impact and access study that follows state Mass DOT guidelines and standards. And the focus of that traffic impact and access study were a number of locations along Canton Avenue that are shown in this diagram, to include the Blue Hills Parkway to the south, and working north all the way up to Reedsdale Road and Center Street at Route 28. You'll see that we've also included the high school driveway here, Guile Road, the driveway itself at Gulliver Street, or opposite Gulliver Street, and a Thatcher Street signalized intersection as well. We had the benefit of actually obtaining traffic volume information pre-COVID for each one of these locations during what would be considered a higher than average volume month of the year. So we have the benefit of having what we think is appropriate and representative traffic data for each of these locations that provides an appropriate basis for evaluating the impact of the project. The next slide, where we begin our process, is really understanding not only what the traffic volumes are today, but what they're likely to be in the future, in fact, 7 years into the future. In addition to normal area growth patterns, of course, there's the traffic generated by the site itself. To understand and estimate what that is, we turn again to industry standards that are well-recognized, published standards by the Institute of Transportation Engineers, ITE, for mid-rise residential developments like this. And we, based on a 124-unit scenario, we're estimating, using those standards, that there would be a total of between 45 and 55 total vehicles on an hourly basis on a weekday that would be generated during the traditional peak hours. Right? These are hours that would represent the highest combination of traffic between what's generated at the site and what is generated on Canton Avenue. Over the course of an entire day, about 674 total trips. You'll see during the peak hours that there is a very distinct directional pattern associated with this. Exiting in the morning, about 33 vehicles per hour. or one vehicle every 2 minutes would be leaving that driveway, or as D'Artagnan, we call it the colonnade, to Canton Avenue. And likewise, returning in the evening, about 34 trips, about one vehicle every 2 minutes. Not extraordinarily high volumes, certainly not in relation to the existing volumes that are on Canton Avenue, which itself carries more than 12,000 vehicles per day. Next slide. In addition to understanding how much traffic might be generated, we take a very careful look at travel speeds along Canton Avenue from the perspective of calculating appropriate sight lines that would need to be provided at the driveway so that anyone leaving the driveway, attempting to make a turn left or right, would have sufficient visibility to an oncoming vehicle. And for that oncoming vehicle to have sufficient visibility and time to react to a vehicle that might be leaving the property. And in this particular section of Canton Avenue, the speeds are not extraordinarily high. They're actually measured at between 35 and 36 miles per hour for the 85th percentile travel speed. The 85th percentile travel speed happens to be the statistical value at which design attempts to meet certain criteria. In this case, Canton Avenue is a 30-mile-an-hour posted limit. The 85th percentile speeds are just slightly above that, 35 to 36, and that speed, that 85th percentile speed, is the basis that we calculated required sight lines. We're pleased to say that there is more than 500 feet of available sight line, either looking toward the driveway or from the driveway on to an oncoming vehicle, where the actual requirement based on those speeds would be about 250 to 260 feet. So we've got more than enough sight line to easily meet those criteria, those standards, safety-based standards. Next slide would show the equivalent, what's known as intersection sight distance, as opposed to a stopping sight distance, which would be the time a vehicle would be required to come to a complete stop before coming into contact with another vehicle. The intersection sight distance is a convenience-based standard that, again, is calculated in a very similar way on the 85th percentile speed to ensure that anyone who's traveling on Canton Avenue does not have to unduly slow down while a vehicle is exiting the driveway. And those requirements on an ideal basis would be between 290 and 335 feet. Again, we more than meet that standard with an available ISD of more than 500 feet. Next slide, as we look at the impact of project traffic on area roadways, each of those 5 locations that I mentioned earlier, we take the projected volumes, as you recall, that's about one vehicle every 2 minutes, either coming into the development or leaving, depending on time of day. And we distribute that on the local roadway system based on the likely destinations that traffic would have based on journey to work information, employment centers, and existing travel patterns. And this is a very schematic diagram that would show how those trips are distributed on the roadways. And in the larger arrows that are in yellow with blue numbers, those are the number of vehicles that would be generated on each particular segment of roadway over the course of an entire hour, in this example, during a weekday morning commuter period. So as you look to the north towards Route 28, Reedsdale Road, and Canton Avenue and Center Street, we would expect there to be about 18 vehicles per hour, about one vehicle every 4 minutes on average, to or from Center Street to the north, only about 4 or so on Reedsdale. Thatcher Street might have 10 or 11 cars per hour. And as we look to the south at toward Blue Hills Parkway and Uncle Road, between 3 and 9 vehicles per hour, not extraordinarily high numbers. And the PM equivalent of that, which is the next slide, shows very, very similar numbers. And they're just slightly higher, but again, the volumes themselves are very unremarkable. They're pretty well distributed. The upshot of that is that from a capacity or operating perspective, none of those additional vehicles that would be generated by this property would have a material consequence to operations at any one of these locations. And in fact, we know on a letter grade rating system that most of these locations operate at a level of service C or better operation. In a suburban location such as this, we would hope to achieve at least a D or better operation. The only exception would be the more complex intersection to the north at Reedsdale Road, Canton Avenue, and Center Street, which has longer delays during peak hours, but those delays will not be materially affected by this project. There will be no change in how that letter designation functions or what the actual delay values are there, not anything that would be noticeable to the average motorist. Finally, as we focus on other aspects of the project, we look at circulation. This is a computer model of the largest potential responding vehicle to the site, which is the Milton Ladder 1, the E1 Cyclone 2. It's a very long vehicle, a ladder truck. You'll see the swept path analysis, which is what this is showing, indicates that that vehicle can easily circumnavigate the property and can access and again leave the property without undue encroachment to opposing vehicles. So the next slide would show the same equivalent on the departing, I believe the next slide, yeah, the departure of that vehicle back to Canton Avenue. So the geometry, the roadway widths and layout are all sufficient for emergency access and circulation purposes. Finally, as we look at other aspects of the project, of course, we've talked about adequate sight lines, modest trip generation, and adequate capacity. We also look at transportation demand management actions, which is on the next slide. These programs are really focused on not only looking at vehicle traffic, but how you can connect the property for pedestrian accommodation. We know that there are sidewalks that are in fact good repair along Canton Avenue that we'll be connecting to, so that residents of this development would have the opportunity to walk to Canton Avenue and along Canton Avenue. Bicycle amenities are also considered. There will be bike racks provided near the buildings to encourage that mode of transportation to or from the property. I will note that Canton Avenue is designated as a shared bicycle route. There are share markings on Canton Avenue, and we would attempt to take advantage of that to encourage people to use that as a mode of travel rather than necessarily relying entirely on automobile. Finally, and last but not least, we do recognize that there is one location at Canton Avenue, Reedsdale Road, and Center Street that has a slightly elevated crash rate. It is listed as what they know, what's called a highway safety improvement program location, an HSIP location, which means that because it has a slightly elevated crash experience, that it is eligible for federal funding for safety-based improvements. And we are suggesting that because of that status, that a road safety audit be conducted to identify specific safety-related improvements that could be brought to bear there, that quite frankly exist independent of the project, will not be made worse as a function of the project, but certainly there could be a road safety audit process that's implemented by the proponent to help guide the town and possibly implementing safety-based improvements at that location. And there is one more slide. I'm sorry, Dr. So right after this, there should be one more slide.
Robert, it's not pulling up. Sorry.
Oh, okay. There are other, suggestions for transportation demand management that will be offered by the proponent, and D'Artagnan's going to try to.
I know. I don't think it's in there.
Okay, that's okay. Well, that covers the majority of Transportation, we will be getting into more detail in a subsequent hearing. We are in receipt of a peer review on the study, which will be discussed in more detail at an upcoming hearing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob.
So with that, Mr. Chair, I think we'll turn things back over to the board. That's our presentation for tonight, and we would appreciate your feedback and that of the public.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Schomer, and to each of the presenters here this evening. I guess what I would suggest next is that we open this up to questions about some of the materials that have and thoughts that have been presented. And I guess I would start with Mr. Corcoran, see if he has any questions for any of the presenters this evening. Maybe Mr. Corcoran's not here anymore.
Well, I'm here, Mr. Hurley. I haven't gone anywhere. I'm sorry, I was muted.
Okay.
I think what I'd like to do is ask the board for permission for Cheryl Tagayas, who is a neighbor, also a member of the planning board, to speak and do a brief presentation on issues and concerns that have been raised through the planning board, and may have some other questions for the board following that presentation.
Just as a point of order, I thought that would come at a later time where the town would present whoever they choose to present. But I thought tonight we were focused on the presentation of the applicant and to come to a full understanding of that. So it had been my hope that we would limit this to rather than new presentations, but simply to any questions that people might have about what's been presented. Certainly, when the time for the town presentation comes about, then we will hear from everyone who has anything that they wish to say. So I really wanted it to limit it to questions and open that to whoever, anyone that might have a question for any of the presenters about any of the information that's been presented. Feel free to raise your hand.
I see Ms. O'Donnell's got a hand up, and then I'll be happy to come back
Sure.
after with some questions. Thank you.
Happy to hear from Ms. O'Donnell.
Hello, Mr. Hurley. I just noticed that on the plans, there's a wetland buffer line running through part of the building, and I'm wondering whether the applicant has considered how they're going to address that.
Mr. Chair, I'll turn that over to Civil Engineer Jim DeSalle to talk about the wetlands line.
Thank you.
There is a wetland on the adjacent property, and the entirety of the 30-foot no disturb zone is within the property that actually abuts Mergewood Lane. We are in the 100-foot buffer zone, and we will be filing a notice of intent for that.
Thank you. Any other questions from members of the public or?
Yes,
I
we
have-
I'm sorry, Brian. We
Yes.
have quite a few from the public.
Okay.
All right, so we're going to start with the O'Donnell family. Oh, they can't talk because they're using an older version of Zoom. So
Oh,
I
okay.
am going to promote them to panelists so they can speak.
Okay.
O'Donnell family, if you can put your speaker on. There you
Okay, I'm sorry. I have a couple of quick questions. I was wondering if there's been a cumulative analysis on the impacts of traffic and stormwater for the two properties? Or is I understand that we're just talking about one now, but my concern is, do we have the impacts of the two properties if they both go through?
Can that be answered with a simple yes or no answer?
Not with a simple yes or no. I guess I would defer to Mr. DeSalle and Mr. Michaud again for their responses to that.
Yeah, I can say that again, Bob Michaud with MDM Transportation Consultants. We're aware that there's a potential for the adjoining property to be allowed to proceed under a 40B process, but we're not at that point yet. That has not been formally acknowledged or allowed. If it does meet the the proper tests to allow to move forward, we would evaluate the impacts of that at that time, and that would become new information to the board.
So that evaluation hasn't occurred up until this point.
It has not. No. We're not taking a forward view that it will necessarily be approved to move forward. Should it be approved to move forward, we would evaluate it at that time.
And this is for both stormwater and traffic, correct?
Yeah,
We've looked at the drainage. Obviously, it's nothing's been formally submitted yet, but we've looked at it preliminarily, and we believe that we can get everything to work satisfactorily.
Because I'm sure you're aware we already have major stormwater issues on Gulliver, Elm, and Wendell Park.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, my next question was just some clarification about the percentage of units that are affordable housing and how they're going to be counted towards the 10% requirement for Milton. What I heard was 10% of the units were going to be for affordable housing, but yet all the units were going to count towards the number that Milton needed to hit a certain percentage.
Mr. Chair, I can clarify that. Ma'am, the percentage of affordable units in the building will actually be 25%. The 10% number, that's the number of 3-bedroom units in the project, and that's a requirement of DHCD guidelines that we have 3-bedroom units to have some apartments that would be more desirable to families. But the current DHCD regulations, they attempt to promote rental housing, and so any project that is a rental development that has at least 25% of its units restricted as affordable can count all 100% of the units in that development, even though only 25% of them are restricted as affordable. So 124 units would count to the SHI once if this project is approved.
Okay, and what constitutes affordable?
Mr. Chair, I can answer that one as well. Affordable in this instance would be restricted by, there would be a regulatory agreement between us and Mass Housing, which would restrict the units to occupants who earn at or below 80% of the area median income.
And offhand, do you know that number?
Not offhand, no, I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for the questions. Anyone else that wanted to pose questions about anything that's been presented?
Yes, so Cheryl wanted to speak earlier, so I'm going to allow.
And what's the name of the person?
Cheryl Sugas?
Tagayas.
I'm sorry, Cheryl.
That's okay. Cheryl Tagayas, can you hear me?
Tagayas.
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Cheryl Tagayas, 660 Canton Avenue, member of the Planning Board, town meeting member, and member of the Master Plan Implementation Committee. I look forward to the opportunity to discuss in further detail at the time at which the town does its presentations. I would like to pose a few questions, if I may, this evening.
Sure, go ahead.
The site coverage percentage that the applicant presented at 19%, I'd like to have that verified, because in our calculations, the garage floor is nearly 1.6 acres. And in my math, that would be greater than 19%. So if that could be verified in a future meeting, that would be great. And then also, I didn't see an existing condition survey presented this evening. And if that survey were presented, there would be a number of existing trees, the existing trees that are mostly being removed for this development. But some are quite large and perhaps savable at 60 inches and 72-inch beech trees that are in the northwestern corner of the property. And I'd like the applicant at a future meeting, if they would, talk to us about how they did their site analysis relative to looking at the historic character of this part of Milton and their site, Holmes Lane and homes that date back to the 1700s, and this particular home, which dates to 1891. And this stretch of Canton Avenue itself is a scenic road. It's very close to the historic district at Town Center. There's hundreds of homes along Canton Avenue, which are listed on the Mass Historical Commission's MACRIS database. And it would be helpful to understand how the applicant has taken a look at this historic context and drawn from it in their proposal. The other thing that I would say is there are stone walls around the periphery of this property. The new roadway is proposed to be very close to those stone walls. So I'd like to hear from the applicant about how they plan to protect those stone walls to preserve that aspect of the historic aspect of the site. And I would just like to note that if the applicant also referenced a number of dimensional characteristics and compared them to some other multifamily developments. And they did that in plan only, and the distance of buildings to single family residences. We submitted a detailed analysis comparing this application with other multifamilies in Milton. And I would note that most of those multifamilies are in smart growth districts, very close to the trolley stations, so public transportation. And the ones that are further away are Winter Valley and Fuller Village. And the characteristics of those sites are quite different from the ones along the smart growth locations. So I think it would be beneficial for them to show us how they analyze the sites that are more comparable to the ones to this one. And in fact, Winter Valley is just a stone's throw away and would serve as a good example of how you can provide multifamily in scale that's more comparable or more compatible with the surrounding context. So thank you, Mr. Chair. I look forward to presenting a few more of our analyses and raising other issues at the appropriate time.
Thank you. That was sort of a mixture of questions and commentary. And I'll leave it to the applicant. To the extent that there were questions that can be answered this evening, please do so. Otherwise, I suppose we could wait until after the peer review process. I'll leave that to you, Jesse, and to your team.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think several of those points that Ms. O'Donnell asked us about, we'll have to get back to you about and confirm those details. So we'll, if we may, we'll take that as a homework assignment and follow up at a future date.
Sure. I mean, at the next session of the hearing, my anticipation is that we're going to hear from the town. They will make their presentation and point out whatever issues they need to point out and raise any questions that are appropriate. And so we'll hear many of these issues that I think we've just touched upon with the last speaker, and certainly we'll give you every opportunity, the applicant, to answer questions and respond at the appropriate time. Are there any other members of the public or anyone else who has questions for the applicant? And I truly would like to make, I would like to make them questions if at all possible.
Sure. Mr. Chair, I have some questions. Ned Corcoran.
Thank you, Ned.
Thank you. I note on the existing conditions plan that there were 6 test pits, as Mr. DeSalle described, 3 taken in February, 3 taken in September, and show a fairly significant discrepancy in the level of groundwater. I wonder if the applicant could explain the differential in groundwater and the effect of the level of groundwater would have on the intention to install stormwater detention systems within what appears to be high groundwater table within the wet season.
Mr. Chair, I'll once again, if I may, I'll turn to Jim DeSalle to answer that question.
We did the soils test, and then I don't know if you've reviewed the plans or not, and we're not doing recharge. The drainage system is more of a detention system where we're containing the water that we're on site, and we're letting it out into the town system over a period of time. And part of the reason is the high groundwater and the soils maintained on site.
I would have a follow-up question with respect to that, whether there would be any chance to detain if water table is so high that there's no place for the water to go in a serious storm event.
We cover all the storm events. If you've looked at the drainage analysis for the 2, 10, 25, and 100-year storm.
We look forward to some follow-up explanation on that, Mr. Chair.
Mr. DeSalle, does that mean, just out of curiosity, does that mean that it's designed to, that detention system is designed to hold the water even in a 100-year event?
Correct. And it incrementally lets it out. That's the whole, the point of it.
Mr. Corcoran, did you have any other questions?
Yes, I'm wondering whether there's any geotechnical been done on the site. We understand there's a fairly significant amount of rock out there. Whether they've done any tests to understand where the rock is and whether that would have effect on the flow of groundwater and the ability to detain water within the site.
Is there anyone among the
Can I answer that?
Please do.
Okay, no, we've done test pits, and we typically do the test pits in the areas that we think that the drainage system is going to go. Geotechnical has not been done to this point. We will be doing geotechnical because it's going to be required for the building and such, but that's going to come a little bit later on.
And I note that there is no geotechnical or test pits performed in the location of the detention system that's proposed to be installed under the building.
That's the one. Yeah, that's the one spot that we have not done a test pit. Correct.
And I'm wondering whether or not they understand whether that the provision of a detention system under the building is compliant with with plumbing code and other requirements.
The cell, is that something you can answer?
It's something we've done many times. I know we've run into this on another project on the other side of town, that the people, the peer review people, didn't suggest it, and we've moved it outside in that case. But when you're doing recharge, it's a little different than detention, and it's a smaller system in this case here. So we can look into it to see if we can get it outside of the existing building or not.
I'd ask whether they performed a hydrology analysis determining where groundwater flows and how it flows, and what the effect of installing what I think is a very large bathtub in the middle of that groundwater, and what effect it would have on diverting groundwater that's currently flowing through the site, perhaps to off-site in either direction. As I understand it, groundwater flows from the southeast to the northwest, and we're installing we're putting in a 12-foot cut with a new significant wall that will be placed in the flow of the groundwater. Wondering whether they've had any analysis of the flow of groundwater and where that groundwater may go relative to the introduction of this new bathtub
We're going to be doing additional testing, absolutely.
With res-
Can I just say, as part of this process or at some future date?
No, it'll be before the end of this process, correct?
So that would that come in, that testing come in response to what you anticipate from the peer review process?
Correct.
Anything else, Mr. Corcoran?
Yes, with respect to traffic, I'm wondering what type of analysis was done relative to the signal, volume of traffic, and the difficulty of the signal at Thatcher and Highland Street. As you proceed north from the main site driveway towards Highland and Thatcher, there is no left turn capacity. There is no independent left turn capacity coming north. The Highland and Thatcher Streets operate on separate signal activation and with high volume of traffic coming through, particularly in the morning on the commuter direction. I'm wondering what type of analysis has been done relative to the impact of the signal and the introduction of fairly significant amount of new traffic to that signal.
Yeah, the analysis that's presented in our traffic study that has been the subject of peer review documents that that analysis. It was done to an industry standard. We did computerized modeling of that intersection, and it has a sufficient capacity to accommodate the additional trips of the project.
They're using the ones close to least.
I would also ask whether they've evaluated the traffic volumes during what we would call a third peak, which would be the after high school peak time of traffic on this section of Canton Avenue.
The answer to that is that the volumes on Canton Avenue, while they do get elevated during the school release period, are not as high as the traditional peak hours on the street, and the site itself is not generating very much traffic at that hour either. So the incremental impact of the project during that time is no greater than what it would be during the analysis periods that were cited, the AM and PM peak hours. Again, subject to peer review in their concurrence in our methodology.
And I'd like to be interested in hearing the applicant describe how this project would comply with sustainable development principles relative to traffic, relative to the protection of land and ecosystems, relative to opportunity for transportation choice. This project is substantial distance from shopping districts, from transit facilities, from work destinations, et cetera. We think it's highly car dependent, and there are very limited opportunities for use of transportation choice. So I'd be interested in hearing more specific details relative to the way that this project would respond to the sustainable development principles that have been advocated by the Commonwealth.
Mr. Chair, I think that's one we're going to have to leave for another day. We'll take that one under advisement.
Okay. We can take that up as at the next session, I guess.
Sure.
But my last question for tonight is a little bit of follow up on one of Ms. Tagayas's questions. But there are, as she indicated, there are a significant number of mature trees, several that are called out specifically within the existing conditions plan, 72-inch beech, 60-inch beech, 30-inch deciduous, all significant trees that appear to be within the footprint of the overall building and/or detention basin and/or driveway. I'm wondering what efforts the development team has undertaken to preserve those trees and to work around the preservation of those trees on the site.
Mr. Chair, I would rely on Mr. Hines, who I think is still on, to talk about his approach to that. What I can say is that there are a number of efforts that we have made to save mature trees on the site, and some have been identified specifically as important trees to steer clear of in terms of both the construction and the ultimate development. But I'll let Blair speak further on that.
Okay.
I think mostly what I like to say is that I appreciate the comment and that we will take a look at the trees, and we'll need to coordinate that effort with Jim DeSalle and some of the stormwater detention structures. But I think it's a very good task to look at in some greater detail. So I think that's a valid point that we need to look at. Thank you.
I'm sure we'll have more questions as the process moves forward, but I thank you for the opportunity to ask these questions tonight.
You've asked some very good questions, Mr. Corcoran, and they'll require some further answers and I guess analysis over time. Are there any others among the general public that have additional questions that they'd like to pose tonight?
Judy's had her hand up for some time now.
Who has? I'm sorry.
Judy Barrett.
Always happy to hear from Judy.
So, Mr. Chair, I just wanted to respond to a question that someone asked earlier when the applicant's attorney was discussing the 80% of area median income, and someone asked kind of what that was, and there wasn't an answer to that question. So I just thought it would be helpful to people to know. Under current conditions today, a household of two would be eligible for affordable housing in Milton with an income that doesn't exceed $77,000 a year, or a household of four at $96,250. So the income limits are tied to the size of the household, and the income limits are updated every year by HUD. So that's all. I just wanted to provide that information for context because she asked a question and she deserved an answer.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other hands up with questions?
There are not. Wait a minute. Denise Quayle. I'm sorry. Denise?
Hi, good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for the opportunity to ask some questions. In terms of transportation, I don't know if I heard you correctly. My audio may have cut out. Did you say that the mile per hour on Canton Ave was 35 miles per hour?
Through the chair, the posted limit in that vicinity is 30 miles per hour.
30 miles per hour, okay. I know that there was an initiative at some point townwide to reduce that to 25, so I don't know if that is going to play on your numbers at all. But if you could run those numbers, I think it would be very helpful just so that we're prepared for that if that is the case townwide. Just a suggestion. And, you know, I know that Ned's motion initially was denied without prejudice. But, you know, obviously the elephant in the room is that the traffic from the other project that's being proposed really does need to be examined in light of this project. So I hope that there's an opportunity at some point to get that elephant out of the room and put it where it needs to be. I also wanted to know if there was any analysis on impact on our school system, which I'm very, very concerned with. We've already, you know, have a concern in town, and maybe this is part of the peer review. It wasn't addressed at all during this initial presentation. So I'm hoping that we'll hear more about that later on. And then selfishly, I didn't say, I do live at 64 Old Farm Road, which abuts this at some point, maybe not a direct abutter, but pretty close. My property is shown on your plans. So I'm wondering what the distance is from the building to this neighborhood. You showed distances from Milton High to other, you know, neighboring properties. I'm wondering what the distance is here. I'm also wondering the height of the initial fourth floor when you come in off Canton Ave. I think you said was 57 feet. I'm wondering if that is just the height of the building, or does that include the garage spaces underneath? And I'm also wondering what the height is on the other side, the back side of the building, if you will, that fourth story, what the height of that is. And my last comment or question has to do with, I know the traffic study was done pre-COVID. I know they've increased the size of Milton Hospital recently, so I don't know if that was taken into account. Ambulances and other access, emergency vehicles that need to access the hospital, and if that specifically was looked at to make sure that the impact of this traffic, doesn't negatively impact response times there. I think that's all I have.
I think that some of Ms. Quealy's more specific questions about the height is something I can turn over to D'Artagnan. But what I would respond to from myself is as to her question about impacts on school systems. The Chapter 40B process is pretty clear that school impacts is not something that the zoning board may take into consideration in its assessment of this project. And in fact, they were not involving 40B specifically, but more generally the question of zoning. There were two land court cases of import, and I know about them because I was one of the lead attorneys on one of them, which reached the conclusion last year that school impacts are not relevant to zoning in any respect in terms of assessing impacts of projects on the neighborhood. Based on the fact that there's a constitutionally protected right of an education for all residents in the town of Milton and in every community. So the issue of school impacts, I think, is not relevant to this proceeding. And with that, I would turn it over to D'Artagnan to answer the specific questions about height.
Great, thank you, Jesse. So in terms of height, the maximum height, including the garage at the northern end towards Canton Ave, is 5610. Again, that's the 4 residential over the garage. And then as you get to the south end, it's about 45 feet at the southwest corner, and then it goes down to 34 feet at the southeast corner. Thank you.
So can I ask, am I still, I guess I'm still on. In terms of the school impact, I understand the land court cases, and thank you for that, Jesse, in terms of your clarification there. Is there any sort of mitigation though, as a good neighbor, if you will, coming in, being a developer, that you would, that is a huge community impact that you would consider there?
Mr. Chair, I'm not sure how to respond to that. I think, that this may not be responsive to the question, but, my clients as the owners of this property would be paying the same property taxes as everyone else in the town of Milton. So that's how the schools are funded. In terms of the impact on schools, I think that's just really outside of what is to be considered in this process. So. Mr. Chair, I would just also, I believe you're on mute. I look like you were about to say something a moment ago.
Oh, now.
We can hear you.
Yep.
That's in that sua sponte. I didn't touch anything. It just did it on its own. Well, if we've covered all the questions for the evening, I think it's probably
Mr. Chair,
we have quite a few attendees, so.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry, Bev. I thought you had the last one. That's fine. We'll take them and we'll take them as long as we have them.
So there's Scott Worsley.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you so much. For the record, Scott Horsley. I'm a hydrologist working with Ned Corcoran, and I have 2 questions for Jim DeSalle through you, Mr. Chairman, if I may.
Okay, so are you asking these questions as an expert as opposed to a resident of Milton?
I'm asking them on behalf of residents of Milton. I'm working with Ned Corcoran and the abutters. And I have a clarification question, which I think is important to your review of the project.
Okay,
So if I may.
you can ask a question.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. So I have two questions. The first one is just a follow-up to Attorney Corcoran's question earlier. The water levels on the site have varied dramatically in the test pits, specifically test pits 3 and 4 by more than 8 feet. And first question is, would you be willing to do some water level measurements in April and May, when we all know that's the high time of the year? And as we all know, this site is constrained by high water levels, and that would be a really important base elevation to make sure that we are aware of. So the question is, would you be willing to do some additional water level measurements in April or May? And I do have a second question.
I don't know who would answer that question.
I'll let that one go to Jim once again to answer, I guess, perhaps a slightly modified question of whether he thinks it's appropriate or necessary.
The issue there is we did testing at 2 different times of the year. That's a better question to ask for Jim Burke, who's our the PE that's actually did the testing. And he's actually not here right now. And unfortunately, he'll be back for the next meeting. And we can address it at that point. We can't wait till next April. Or actually, I'm sorry, we can probably do additional testing, which we're gonna do.
Yes.
Within the next few weeks. I apologize. I'm like just meetings after meetings. I'm losing my mind.
Yes. Just to clarify, I'm sorry.
We're going to be doing additional testing, obviously, and I'm
that's great.
that we're going to be getting more peer review information.
So you will be doing additional testing. That's great to know.
Absolutely. We were waiting for the peer review.
Okay. Anything else, Mr. Horsley?
You're muted, Scott.
I'm sorry. Can you hear me again? Sorry, I got muted.
Yes.
Second question for Mr. DeSalle is that you mentioned, sir, that you were not doing any groundwater recharge on the site. But as Attorney Schomer correctly pointed out earlier, this project does need to comply with state standards. And state standards in the Wetlands Protection Act, standard number 3, requires recharge on the site. So I'm wondering if you can clarify your statement that you're not going to do recharge, but that one of the 10 standards, Mass DEP within wetlands jurisdiction, is in fact to provide recharge.
I'd like to actually bring on Cam Campbell, who's from our office, that actually did the drainage on this.
Thank you.
He could probably answer that better than I can.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is he here tonight?
Yeah, he's coming on
thank
now.
you.
Hello, I'm Cam Campbell with the Selberg Sala. I actually did the testing on site for the soils, and I had a part in doing the drainage design as well. And in response to the first question about the soil testing varying, the first day we did the soils testing, it was very dry out. And then the second day was after heavy rains. So the second day is more the second set of test pits, which is, I believe, which were done in 2020 of February the 26th, is a better judgment of the groundwater, which is at around 20 inches below the surface. The problem is the soils are very, very tight on site. They're a very tight sandy loam, very silty, and the groundwater does not infiltrate into the soils. It just runs off site very quickly. That doesn't have a chance to infiltrate. It just runs over the top and just runs along the layer of the B soils, which is just below the topsoil. It runs along the top layer of the really tight soils and it just runs off the site. And then according to to answer the second question about standard 3, given the high soils on site and the tight soils being as D soils, we're meeting it to the maximum extent practicable, and we're working with what's available on site. We believe that trying to infiltrate on this site would just make the matters of flooding worse, and the detention is really the only option on a site like this, and that it helps, that the design as proposed decreases the peak runoffs for the 2, 10, 25, and 100-year storm with detention. And we put in water quality treatment units to treat any runoff before it gets put underground and let into the town stormwater system.
Mr. Chairman, just one final follow-up with Mr. Campbell, if I may.
Okay.
So what you're saying is you can't meet standard 3 because of the high water table conditions that are constraining the site, which could be grounds for the fact that, let me form this as a question, I'm sorry. Are you saying that you can't meet standard number 3, which is required in the wetlands protection regulations, because the site is constrained by a high water table? Is that what you're saying?
Not specifically a high water table, it's specifically the table and the type of soil on site, which in the standard it allows for, if there are extenuating soils, it allows for recharge to be met to the maximum extent practical.
I actually drafted that standard. Which part are you talking about that provides that flexibility? I'm unaware of that.
Let me bring it up real quick.
While he's doing that, Mr. Chair, if I just might offer a suggestion, this is getting obviously pretty deep into the weeds on a very technical question that obviously Mr. Horsley has a great deal of expertise about.
Thank you.
My suggestion would be that we put a pin in this issue and maybe take it up after the town's peer reviewer weighs in, because the town's peer reviewer, if this is a concern that we'll need to address, I have no doubt that they'll let us know.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, I think that makes sense to handle it in that way. It is a complicated issue, and I don't think I want to force the person to answer off the top of its head. It's something I think that will be taken up in the peer review. And indeed, in some ways, Mr. Horsley's presentation was more in the nature of a peer review than it was really questions, at least along the lines I was anticipating tonight. So we can certainly take up the issues of surface and groundwater in some detail during the peer review process, and to the extent issues are identified, we'll then look to the developer to address those issues. But I think that's probably a highly technical area that's better left for another day. So why don't we move on?
Tim?
Bev, are there others waiting?
Yeah, just Tim Sawinski. Yep.
Okay.
Hi, Mr. Chair. Two, I think, procedural type questions and comments. One thing on a very kind of tech-related issue, I see that there's a number of written questions in the Q&A function. I think a couple of those folks have piped up orally, but I don't know if they all have. So it's up to the board how you want to deal with those. I don't want people slipping through the cracks, but I think from a future kind of looking perspective, I think the board should consider how it wants to treat that functionality. You know, there is the hand raise function, which I think we've been using with some success in other hearings in terms of recognizing people who want to make comments. But there is that written component that is available. And I think, you know, and we can obviously provide whatever sort of technical or IT support the board needs. But we may want to think about, you know, whether that's a functionality that we want to continue with, or we want to keep it to oral kind of hand raising type comments.
I can't respond to that tonight. We'll have to
Yeah, I
think
just
about
wanted to,
that.
and that may be something that we bring up offline, and maybe with Judy and some of our IT people about how we want to talk through that. And the second question I had to do with scheduling. I think the next hearing that's scheduled is for Thursday.
No, actually, the next hearing, we had originally planned to schedule a hearing date on Thursday, but there's a conflict that has arisen with that. And so the next hearing in this matter is actually a week from today. Let me just check my dates here.
March 16th, Mr. Chairman.
That's right, on Thursday, March 16th. And I think we were going to try in the future to sort of stick to a Thursday night schedule.
Tuesday nights, Mr. Chair.
Okay, Tuesday, I'm sorry.
That's all right.
I'm losing my mind.
We all are. Too many nights.
But whatever night it is, it was going to be that night each week.
Yeah.
So the 16th is the next date.
Okay, good.
Winsky.
And what did you anticipate the topic area there to be?
Traffic. The traffic peer
Okay.
review.
Okay, is it Judy, is it just the traffic peer review that's going to be
Yes.
presented that night?
Traffic is on the 16th, the site civil is the 23rd, and architectural is the 30th.
All right, fine.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The reason I bring it up is a couple of reasons. As I stated in the town's written testimony, all of the department heads that have a review function over these development projects have reviewed and analyzed the application and have provided written comments. I'll be reporting back on any issues that come up during the course of the presentations. But we were interested in reserving oral testimony until we've had a chance to review the peer review reports,
Okay.
which it sounds based on the schedule that Judy just laid out. There should be plenty of time for us to take a look at those and have an opportunity for town testimony after the next three hearings, depending on the schedule that the board determines.
Yeah, it makes sense to me that you could follow the peer reviewers with the town's commentary.
And we'll also, I mean, in addition to department heads, we'll also, as you're aware, Ms. Tagayas from the planning board, representing the planning board in the review of this particular project, we'll have some testimony as well. And I'm also in the process of wrangling up other boards and commissions that may want to be heard on this matter. But I'll definitely keep you posted as to what we anticipate the testifiers to look like for that hearing.
Okay, we'll look forward to that, but that will be the plan. We'll do the three successive Tuesday nights with peer review presentations. I guess we'll follow that up with the town's presentation. Go from there.
May I speak?
Yes.
I would also like to acknowledge with Tim that I have all these Q&A also. So with all due respect to everyone who is sending in these questions, Tim, the answers certainly should be forthcoming. We will work on getting back to them or addressing them live, maybe the next meeting, please advise.
So Bev, I would ask if this is a little bit on the fly, if our partners at Milton Access TV are listening, if they could chime in. Do we have the ability to access like a transcript of the Q&A?
Access what?
That was a question for Milton Access TV if
Oh.
they're if they're listening in. So I'll be perfectly honest. I don't know if when we close this this window, if there's a, we're recording this meeting, but I don't know if the transcript of those written questions gets recorded. So I mean, what I would say, and this is again, up to the board. If folks that have submitted a written question could raise their hands and get into a queue to ask those questions orally. I think just tonight, I don't think we're properly staffed to both monitor the sort of oral testimony and also keep an eye on the written Q&A. So I think the fairest thing to do would be to ask folks to raise their hands and ask their questions orally. And if we don't get to you, then I think at a future hearing, we'll try to have some consistent guidance as to how that functionality gets dealt with.
Well, Tim, I didn't even know there was such a function as a Q&A until you brought it up this evening. But would there be a way to somehow, maybe the answer to this is obvious to everyone but me, but would there be a way to get that Q&A to the board at least, and maybe to Mr. Schomer, so that we could respond to that Q&A at the next session of the public hearing?
So that's the question that I had, and I don't know what the answer is to that. So,
but my recommendation going forward is that we not have the Q&A if that's possible, because I think it just injects a complicated process into the mix, and it's already fairly complicated. But for those folks that relied upon its availability tonight and submitted questions, I think we ought to take whatever steps we can to answer those questions by having them made available at the next session of the public hearing, and perhaps making them available in advance certainly to the applicant's counsel, so that we can answer those questions at the next session.
I would suggest that each and every one of them, I have their names. I will go into this tomorrow, and that they submit an email to me, and that we will go forward with an email.
Okay, and you in turn, Bill, when you got those emails, you would copy everyone that you needed to, including Mr. Schomer, so that we would be in a position to respond to those questions at the next session of the public hearing.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Mr. Chair,
hello.
Would you post those to the website?
Make a suggestion. I was able to pull these questions and comments up and copy them to a Word document, so I'd be happy to file that with Beverly as soon as we conclude.
That sounds great.
Wonderful.
Hello, this is the O'Donnell family. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I was wondering also for the next meeting, if we could get some historical data about flooding in the area, because I know, for example, the year that it flooded out the MBTA, I think it may have been 1996, there was a significant impact to Gulliver, Elm, Channing, Channel, with regards to stormwater runoff and flooding. So if there's any historical data in the town about, either from the fire department, about pumping out basements, because I can imagine a development of this size with all the runoff, I don't even believe that was a 100-year event. If we have, all this new development in the area, what the impacts of that would be to this neighborhood. So I think it was 96.
I think the best answer that I can give to you on that is that perhaps the town can, part of its presentation, when it makes that presentation, perhaps it could address that issue. I'll leave that to the town.
This will significantly impact these 3 streets.
Okay. Well, I think it certainly merits further study and consideration, and maybe we could raise it when the town makes its presentation after the peer review process is completed.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, I think it seems as if we've come to a logical ending point for this evening's session. Do we all agree?
Yes,
Mr. Dave or Mr. Brown, was there anything that you wanted to add or to the festivities tonight or to say?
No, Mr. Chair.
I have no questions at this point. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I mean, I think this was a good first session of the public hearing. I think there was a good exchange, and I think that exchange will continue. Obviously, the applicant has done a lot of work and has a lot of very well-versed professionals who have presented some information this evening, and I look forward to the peer review process where maybe some of that information can be tested by the peer reviewers. And when we finish that process, as I just indicated a moment ago, the town will have its opportunity to present whatever evidence that it wants to bring to bear on this issue, and go forward from there. So I'll look forward to hearing from and seeing you all on the 16th,
Chair,
Tuesday.
Could I ask one question? Would our experts material be reviewed by the town's peer review experts?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Would we have significant sets of expert opinions to submit? I'm wondering whether the board would allow the peer review experts that have been hired on behalf of the board to review that information in context of the peer review analysis that it's done with respect to the applicant's plans.
Ms. Barrett, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, not exactly. I mean, I understand what Attorney Corcoran's asking, and I certainly think the peer review consultants may want to access that information. But of course, the applicant's obligation to the board is to pay to have the applicant's submissions peer reviewed. I mean, that's what the applicant's obligation is. So I just want to make that clear. The peer review consultants haven't necessarily budgeted to be reviewing two things, both the applicant submission and the neighborhood. So, you know, it would be really up to each, I think, consultant, but certainly the information could be provided to them.
Right, and what they do with it at that point is unclear, but
yeah,
sure, we can certainly make it available to them.
Yeah,
I mean, I can't direct them obviously to review it. It's not within my purview to do that, but we can do that.
Mr. Chair, if Attorney Corcoran provides me with those reports, I've passed those along to the peer reviewers for the other hearing. So Ned and I can work that out tomorrow.
Okay, thank you, Tim. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Okay, well, with that,
Mr. Chair, that we also receive copies of those.
Oh, certainly.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you all for your participation and your assistance in this complicated application. And I look forward to hearing from you all again a week from today at 7 o'clock. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.